My father drew the line at the dining room doorway. Not a physical line. Worse, a verbal one. The kind that's invisible, but everyone understands. "All right," he said, adjusting the reading glasses he wore when he wanted to look professorial. "After dessert, I've invited a few colleagues to discuss investment opportunities in the study. Serious conversation, serious people." He scanned the room with the careful deliberation of a man selecting guests for a lifeboat. "Kevin, you're in." My brother nodded, already straightening his tie. "Patricia, welcome as always." My cousin Patricia, a mergers and acquisitions attorney, smiled like she'd been called to the stage at an awards ceremony. "David, bring those numbers we discussed." Uncle David, who ran a commercial lending division at a regional bank, tapped his briefcase. Then my father's eyes landed on me. He didn't say anything for a moment. The silence was the sentence. "Cora, honey," he said finally, "why don't you keep your mom company in the kitchen? Help with the dishes. There's some pie left, too." 19 family members processed this in real time. The men had been invited to the study for serious conversation. I had been directed to pie. My name is Cora Aldridge. I'm 35 years old, and I had just been sorted into the kitchen at my parents' Thanksgiving dinner in Westport, Connecticut, while the serious people discussed serious things in the study. This had been happening my entire adult life. Not the specific words, the specific exclusion. Every holiday, every family gathering, every moment where business was discussed, I was redirected to somewhere softer. The kitchen, the living room, the children's table, long past the age when that designation applied. My family believed I worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Bridgeport. Steady, quiet, invisible work. The kind of job that confirmed every assumption they'd already made about my ceiling. What they didn't know was that the bookkeeper story was a fabrication so complete that it had taken me 8 years to construct and maintain. In reality, I was the founder and sole owner of Aldridge Capital Group, a private equity firm that managed $5.8 billion in institutional assets, held controlling stakes in 14 companies, and had generated a cumulative return of $3.2 billion for its investors over the past 8 years. One of those 14 companies was Mercer & Kline Commercial Partners, my father's company, the firm he'd built over 30 years and considered his crowning achievement. The firm he was about to discuss investment opportunities for in his study with serious people. The firm whose majority shareholder was currently being sent to the kitchen for pie. But the part that made tonight different from every other Thanksgiving was this. My father had invited his business partner, Robert Klein, to join the after-dinner discussion. Robert Klein, who had met with me 4 times over the past year at Aldridge Capital's offices in Manhattan. Robert Klein, who had signed documents transferring 52% of Mercer & Kline's equity to my firm 6 months ago. Robert Klein, who knew exactly who I was and had been the only person outside my company aware that the quiet bookkeeper at the Aldridge family Thanksgiving was the woman who now owned his business. Robert was arriving at 8 p.m. It was currently 7:31, 29 minutes until the serious people met the majority shareholder, and she'd be arriving from the kitchen with pie on her fingers. The origin of Aldridge Capital Group starts with a calculator and a grudge. After graduating from NYU Stern with an MBA in finance, I applied for a position at my father's company, not as a favor, as a qualified candidate. I had graduated second in my class. My thesis on distressed asset acquisition had been published in 2 academic journals. 3 major private equity firms had made me offers. I turned them all down because I wanted to build something with my father. He said no. Not because of my qualifications, because of his philosophy. This business isn't a place for family, he'd told me, sitting behind the mahogany desk he was so proud of. Especially not daughters. The partnerships, the negotiations, the pressure. It requires a certain toughness, you understand. I understood perfectly. He didn't think I was tough enough because I was his daughter and because I was a woman. The 3 private equity firms that had made me offers required toughness too. They just measured it in returns instead of gender. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I walked out of his office, drove to my apartment, and made a decision that would take 8 years to fully execute. If he wouldn't let me into his business, I would build something so much larger that his business would eventually come to me. Aldrich Capital Group started with $95,000 in savings, a rented desk in a co-working space, and a strategy so aggressive that 3 banks refused to finance it before the 4th one said yes. My approach was distressed asset acquisition. I specialized in buying controlling stakes in companies that were underperforming due to management failures, restructuring them, and either operating them long-term or selling them at dramatically increased valuations. My first acquisition was a small manufacturing company in New Jersey that was 90 days from bankruptcy. I bought it for $400,000, restructured its operations over 6 months, and sold it 18 months later for $8.2 million. That return attracted attention. A pension fund invested $20 million. Then a university endowment added $50 million. Then a sovereign wealth fund contributed $200 million. The capital compounded. The acquisitions multiplied. By year 4, I managed $1.2 billion. By year 6, $3.5 billion. By year 8, tonight, $5.8 billion. 14 companies under my control. 940 employees across those companies, a track record that had earned Aldrich Capital Group a reputation as the most disciplined private equity firm in the mid-market space. And 6 months ago, I had executed the acquisition I'd been planning since I was 23 years old. Mercer and Klein Commercial Partners, my father's company. The firm had been struggling, not catastrophically, but consistently. Revenue had plateaued. Key clients were migrating to larger competitors. The commercial real estate market was shifting toward technology-integrated solutions that my father's traditional approach couldn't accommodate. Robert Klein, my father's partner of 22 years, had recognized the problem before my father did. Robert had quietly reached out to private equity firms looking for a strategic investor who could inject capital and modernize operations without destroying the firm's identity. My firm was one of several he'd contacted. When Robert walked into Aldrich Capital's conference room and saw me sitting at the head of the table, his reaction was a masterpiece of controlled surprise. He sat down, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "Does your father know?" "No," I replied, "and he can't, not yet." To Robert's credit, he asked only one more question. "Can you save the company?" I showed him our plan. 3 hours later, he signed the term sheet. Aldrich Capital Group acquired 52% of Mercer and Klein for $34 million. I was now the majority owner of my father's company. The company he'd told me I wasn't tough enough to work for. The company he was about to discuss investment opportunities for with serious people in his study, while I ate pie in the kitchen. 7:40 p.m., 20 minutes. In the kitchen, my mother was rinsing dishes with the efficient melancholy of a woman who'd been redirected from serious conversations for 40 years. She hummed while she worked. She always hummed. It was her way of filling the silence that the men in this family created by excluding the women from anything they considered important. "More pie, honey?" she asked, drying a serving platter. "I'm fine," I said. She studied me for a moment. "You look different tonight. Tired?" "Thinking," I said. "About what?" "About doors," I said, "and who gets to walk through them." She smiled the way she did when she didn't understand something but wanted to be supportive. "Well, don't think too hard. It's a holiday." From the dining room, I could hear my father, Kevin, Patricia, and Uncle David migrating toward the study. Their voices carried the particular energy of people who believed they were about to do something important. My phone buzzed. A text from my Chief Operating Officer, Nina Vasquez, who was monitoring the situation from our Manhattan office with the focused intensity of someone watching a chess match enter its final moves. Robert confirmed, arriving at 8 p.m. He's bringing the restructuring proposal, the one with your signature on the first page. I typed back, "Perfect. Has he told my father anything?" "Nothing. He's maintained complete compartmentalization. Your father still thinks Robert found an anonymous institutional investor." I slid the phone into my pocket and picked up a dish towel. My mother handed me a wet plate. We dried dishes in companionable silence while the serious people settled into the study to discuss the future of a company I already owned. 7:52 p.m. 8 minutes. Through the study door, which my father had left slightly ajar because he liked the rest of the house to hear the murmur of important business being conducted, I could hear the conversation beginning. "The offer from Aldridge Capital is solid," Robert's voice carried from inside the study. He'd arrived early. I hadn't heard the doorbell over the running water. "They're injecting $34 million for modernization, technology integration, new client acquisition platform, complete operational restructuring." My father's voice responded, "And we're comfortable with an outside firm having majority control?" "I did my due diligence," Robert said. "Their track record is impeccable. 14 companies restructured, average value increase of 280%. Their managing partner is," he paused, "exceptionally capable." I dried another plate. Kevin was asking questions about the equity structure. Patricia was reviewing the legal terms. Uncle David was analyzing the financing. The serious people doing serious work on a deal that I had originated, structured, negotiated, and funded. From the kitchen, my mother nudged me. "You're drying that plate very intensively." "Sorry," I said, lost in thought. 7:58 p.m. 2 minutes. I set down the dish towel. "I need to use the restroom," I told my mother. She nodded. I walked past the study door. Through the gap, I could see my father at his desk, Kevin in the leather chair, Patricia and David on the sofa, and Robert Klein standing at the whiteboard where he'd drawn a diagram of the restructuring plan. The diagram that I had created in my office 6 months ago. The plan that bore my intellectual fingerprint on every line. I continued past the door to the bathroom, where I checked my phone one final time. "Nina, everything's in position. Robert has the reveal documents in his briefcase. Full ownership disclosure, performance history, managing partner identification. He'll introduce it when you're ready." I typed, "I'm ready. Tell Robert to open the briefcase at 8:05. She replied, 8 years, Cora. You built this for 8 years. Go get your seat at the table." I washed my hands, looked at myself in the mirror, and saw a woman wearing a simple gray sweater and no makeup who was about to walk into a room of serious people and show them what serious actually looked like. I walked back toward the study. My mother called from the kitchen, "Cora, there's more pie if you want." "Maybe later, Mom. I need to talk to Dad about something." She looked surprised. "Serious business stuff?" "Something like that," I said. I pushed open the study door. 5 heads turned. My father's expression was immediate and automatic. The tolerance-tinged impatience he reserved for interruptions he considered beneath the moment. "Cora, we're in the middle of something." "I know," I said. "I'm joining you." He exchanged a glance with Kevin. My brother's face carried the mild embarrassment of someone watching a family member wander into a place they didn't belong. "Honey," my father said, "this is a business meeting. We're discussing the Aldridge Capital acquisition." "I'm familiar with it," I said. I sat down in the one remaining chair, the small one in the corner that nobody had chosen, the chair that existed for guests who weren't expected to speak. My father sighed. "Robert, I apologize. My daughter is." Robert stood up. He looked at me, then at my father, then at the briefcase beside his feet, then back at me. I nodded. Robert opened the briefcase. He removed a folder that I recognized instantly. Cream-colored cover, Aldridge Capital Group embossed in dark blue. The managing partner disclosure document. "Before we proceed," Robert said, and his voice carried a gravity that silenced every other sound in the room. "There's something the family needs to know about Aldridge Capital's managing partner." My father frowned. "We've been through this, Robert. They prefer anonymity. Their track record speaks for itself." "It does," Robert agreed. He opened the folder and placed a single sheet of paper on my father's desk. The managing partner disclosure form. At the top, in clean black type, managing partner and sole owner, Cora Aldridge. He let the name settle. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My father picked up the paper. His reading glasses were already on, which meant he saw the name immediately, without the protective delay of reaching for them. "Cora Aldridge," he read aloud. His voice was flat, clinical. The voice he used when reading contracts, not when processing the fact that his daughter owned his company. His eyes moved from the paper to me. "Aldridge," he repeated. "Your middle name." "Mom's maiden name," I confirmed. "My firm, my money, my acquisition, your company." The study imploded. Not outwardly, inwardly. 5 people experiencing simultaneous gravitational collapse. Kevin leaned forward so fast his chair creaked dangerously. "What?" Patricia's legal composure cracked. She actually gasped. Uncle David's briefcase slid off his lap and hit the floor with a thud that nobody acknowledged. Robert stepped back and stood against the wall, the physical position of a man who had fulfilled his role and was now watching the consequences unfold. My father hadn't moved. He was still holding the paper, staring at the name, his reading glasses magnifying eyes that were processing information his brain refused to accept. "You own 52% of my company?" he said. "I do." "Since when?" 6 months ago. "Robert approached you, or I approached Robert?" "He came to my firm looking for a strategic investor. He found one. He just didn't know she ate Thanksgiving dinner in this house." My father set down the paper, very slowly, the way you set down something that has suddenly become very heavy. $34 million, he said. "You invested $34 million In Mercer and Klein? Yes. From a firm that manages $5.8 billion, I completed. 14 portfolio companies, 940 employees across those companies, 8 years of operation, average return of 280% on restructured assets. The room was vibrating with the energy of recalculation. Every person was rewinding conversations, replaying dismissals, reconstructing their mental image of the woman in the gray sweater who'd been drying dishes 5 minutes ago. Kevin spoke first. His voice was strangled. You manage $5.8 billion, and Dad just sent you to the kitchen? He did, I agreed. For pie. The word pie hung in the air with the weight of 8 years of exclusion condensed into 3 letters. Patricia, the mergers and acquisitions attorney, looked at the disclosure document with professional eyes. This structure, she said slowly, the acquisition terms, the equity allocation, the restructuring plan. She looked up at me. This is flawless. It's the cleanest PE acquisition I've seen in my career. Thank you, I said. I had a good education and 8 years of motivation. My father stood up. His chair rolled back and hit the bookshelf with a soft thump. He walked to the window of his study, the window he'd stood at for 30 years while making decisions about a company he'd built from nothing. The company his daughter now owned. Serious conversation, he said to the window. Serious people. He turned around. I told my own daughter she wasn't serious enough to be in this room. You told me the business wasn't a place for family, I corrected, especially not daughters. He flinched at the direct quote. The words were 12 years old, but they'd been perfectly preserved in the amber of my memory. I remember, he said, every word. You remember saying it, I replied. I remember hearing it. Those are very different experiences. Robert cleared his throat gently. Charles, for what it's worth, your daughter's firm is one of the most respected in the industry. The restructuring plan she developed for Mercer and Klein is going to save this company. Not just save it, transform it. I didn't invest in your firm to punish you, Dad, I said. I invested because the company has good bones. It has loyal clients. It has potential that's being wasted by outdated methods and a leadership structure that excludes the people most capable of fixing it. He looked at me, not at the woman in the gray sweater, at the managing partner of a $5.8 billion firm, at the person who just saved his life's work, at his daughter. I told you that you weren't tough enough, he said, and then you built something worth $5.8 billion, Kevin added quietly. While eating pie in the kitchen, Patricia finished. My father walked toward me. His steps were slow, deliberate. 12 years of miscalculation in every footfall. He stopped in front of me and did something he'd never done in his study. He pulled out his desk chair, the big one, the power seat, and he offered it to me. Sit down, he said. We need to hear the restructuring plan from the managing partner. I looked at the chair, the one I'd been denied since I was 23, the one behind the mahogany desk he was so proud of, the one that represented everything he'd told me I couldn't have. I sat down. It fit. Of course it did. It was always supposed to be mine. The restructuring meeting lasted 3 hours. I presented the full plan. Technology integration, client acquisition platform, operational modernization, leadership development. Kevin asked smart questions. Patricia identified 2 legal optimizations I hadn't considered. Uncle David offered lending contacts that would reduce our financing costs. They were serious people doing serious work. And for the first time, I was in the room. Not because my father had invited me, because I'd bought the room. At 11 p.m., as the family was leaving, my mother stopped me in the hallway. She'd heard everything through the study door. All of it, she said. I heard all of it. I know, I said. You were always listening at that door. She smiled, and in her smile I saw 35 years of her own quiet endurance, her own kitchen exile, her own redirection from the serious rooms where decisions were made. Your grandmother built this house, she said quietly. Did you know that? She designed it. She financed it. She managed the construction. And then your grandfather put his name on the deed, and she spent 50 years serving coffee in the kitchen. I didn't know that, I said. Now you do, she replied. Some women build the house and serve the coffee. You bought the company and ate the pie. I hugged her, the kind of hug that contains more than 2 people, the kind that holds every woman who was ever sent to the kitchen while the serious people talked. My father was the last to leave the study. He stood in the doorway, watching me gather documents from his desk. My desk now, technically. Cora, he said. I looked up. I'm going to say something I should have said 12 years ago. He paused. The retired patriarch, stripped of the authority he'd spent a lifetime constructing. You are the most serious person I have ever known, and I am sorry it took losing my own company to see it. You didn't lose your company, Dad. I saved it. You just weren't in the room when it happened, because you told me I couldn't be. He nodded, the smallest, most honest nod I'd ever seen from him. Can I be in the room now? He asked. It sounded like a man requesting permission to enter his own house. You were always welcome, I said. You just never asked the person in the kitchen. 3 months later, Mercer and Klein Commercial Partners completed its restructuring. Revenue increased 47% in the first quarter under the new technology platform. Client retention hit 96%. 3 major competitors entered partnership discussions. The company my father had spent 30 years building was now worth 4 times what it had been when I acquired it. Not because he was gone, because I was finally present. The financial press picked up the story within weeks of the restructuring results. Bloomberg ran a feature on Aldridge Capital's turnaround strategy, calling it the most efficient mid-market restructuring of the year. The Wall Street Journal published an analysis of our 14 portfolio companies, noting that every single one had seen revenue increases of at least 40% within 12 months of acquisition. Forbes requested a profile. I agreed to one interview. The journalist asked me how I'd built $5.8 billion without anyone in my family knowing. I told her the truth. They never asked. They assumed the quiet woman drying dishes in the kitchen wasn't worth asking. That assumption gave me 8 years of uninterrupted focus. Most founders would kill for that kind of silence. The article ran with the headline, "The $5.8 billion woman who built her empire from the kitchen." My mother bought 30 copies. She placed one on every surface in the house. My father found them in the bathroom, the garage, the study, and taped to the inside of his briefcase. He didn't remove a single one. Robert Klein retired 6 months after the restructuring, satisfied that his company was in better hands than he'd ever imagined. At his retirement dinner, he gave a speech that mentioned me by name. I spent 22 years building Mercer and Klein alongside Charles Aldridge, he said. And the best business decision I ever made was walking into a conference room and discovering that the most capable person in the Aldridge family was the one Charles had sent to the kitchen. My father was in the audience. He cried, quietly, the way men of his generation cry, with his jaw tight and his eyes red and his pride dissolving into something more honest. Kevin left his corporate finance job and joined Aldridge Capital as a portfolio analyst. He was good at it, better than good. He just needed a room where the criteria for entry was competence, not convention. Patricia became our outside counsel. Her legal optimizations saved us $12 million in the first year. My mother started attending every family business meeting. She didn't speak much. She listened. But she was in the room, and that mattered more than anyone expected. My father adapted the slowest. 30 years of building walls don't dismantle in a single evening. But he showed up. He asked questions. He learned the systems I'd built. And at the next Thanksgiving, when the after-dinner discussion began, he didn't draw a line at the doorway. He pulled up a chair next to mine and said the 6 words that rewrote 35 years of family history. "Cora, would you lead the discussion?" "I would," I said. And then I did. From the big chair, with pie on the table and every door in the house wide open. Because the real restructuring was never about the company. It was about the family, about who gets a seat at the table and who gets sent to the kitchen, about who gets called serious and who gets handed a dish towel, and about what happens when the person in the kitchen turns out to be the person who owns the table. Sometimes the most powerful person in the house is the one washing dishes. Sometimes the majority shareholder is the one eating pie by the sink. And sometimes the only way to get a seat at the table is to buy the table and bring your own chair. I brought mine. It was the small one from the corner, the one nobody wanted. And it turns out it was the best seat in the room all along.